I'm Natalie Alexander. Welcome to AI and Multilateralism, a playlist at the UN Library and Archives, Geneva, where we're joined by experts who help us unpack the many ideas at the nexus of AI and international cooperation. Questions on AI ethics are all around us. Today, we're joined by Wendell Wallach, a bioethicist who's been working on the ethics and governance of emerging technologies for decades. He's the author of 2 books, A Dangerous Master and Moral Machines, and until 2024 co-led the Carnegie Council's AI and Equality Initiative. He's also senior advisor to the Hastings Center and a scholar at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where for 11 years he chaired technology and ethics studies. Welcome, Wendell. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
In this episode, we're sharing excerpts from a wide-ranging conversation on the ethics and governance of AI, the relevance of his books on robots and technologies many years after they were first published, and what we can learn from bioethics. I started by asking Wendell what prompted him to work in emerging technologies. You've studied arts, education, divinity, you've worked on spirituality, founded 2 computer consulting firms, all before you began this work. So what prompted you to think emerging technologies is really what I need to be teaching about and working on?
Well, my background has been thinking about human cognition, how it applies to self-understanding, spiritual understanding, moral intelligence, a vast array of different subject areas. And as I was stepping back from the computer consulting companies I'd founded, and I'd found them largely because I had books in my head that I wasn't getting out. And I ended my relationship with them for the exact same reason. I was just caught up in the business of it all and not getting these books out of my head. But in the midst of it, I realized that I'd fallen behind on breakthroughs in emerging technologies, cognitive science, other areas. And one thing led to another, and within weeks, I was invited into the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, new technology and ethics working group. And interestingly enough, that was found by Nick Bostrom and James Hughes and Bonnie Kaplan, some of whom were transhumanists. And they were particularly interested in emerging technologies from the perspective of whether they would help enhance humans' intelligence, lifespan, other things. But I recognized right away that there were a lot of very big ethical issues that weren't being dealt with. And that's what critically interested me, not only in straightforward ways such as, well, if we can enhance human beings, shouldn't we? And if we should, can we do it safely? So that's a bioethical question. So all of that was really there from the get-go. And it was a massive field that encompassed everything from nanotechnology to geoengineering, biotechnology, neuroscience, AI, and other computational technologies. So in trying to get a handle on it, I came up together with 2 other colleagues, Colin Allen and Eva Schmidt, with a project which was the problem of whether computational systems could make moral decisions. And that both narrowed my focus, but it was still a vast topic touching on all kinds of philosophical considerations, and perhaps most importantly, how humans make moral decisions. So we tried to outline that and take some baby steps, bringing together many threads of thought at the time about moral decision-making capacities, and particularly what was being called machine ethics. And in many ways, our book became the foundational, not necessarily the first, there were collections of essays and others, but the first book that really outlined the field. And to this day, it's still cited significantly. But again, though it was ostensibly about whether machines can make moral decisions, In a kind of clever way, we wrote a book about ethics that people read because it was about machines that would probably never have read a book about ethics. So it also became kind of a textbook on human ethics. And one aspect of it that I think is fascinating to this day and has never been dealt with appropriately is when you think about humans making moral decisions, you take for granted consciousness, compassion, theory of mind, being embodied in the world, all these things that actually influence our psychology and our relationship to the decision that you don't presume when you start thinking about machines. You start thinking about, well, to what extent can they reason about moral decisions? And we felt that this aspect of these what we call super rational faculties are as central and beyond emotions have not been given their due over the past couple thousand years. So that was kind of a breakthrough in the way we were thinking about the challenge.
Yeah. And you mentioned this book. You're actually the author of 3 books, 2 on emerging technologies. The one you mentioned is called Moral Machines with Colin Allen, and one called A Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. What's interesting is it was published more than a decade ago in 2015 and was recently republished in 2024, where you drafted a new preface. And reading over that preface, what I thought was also really remarkable was that you wondered if republishing the book would be timely. What do you think? Is it timely now?
I was amazed to find out how timely it was. In many ways, it was perhaps ahead of its time. And that got it probably less than the full reception it might have received otherwise. So there are 2 aspects to that. I mean, I had a project in mind in 100,000 words or less. What ideas, concepts could I expose intelligent citizens to so that they could join in these fascinating debates and reflections, which are core to working through not only the policy considerations, but the societal implications of these emerging technologies. And that was what I was surprised is actually how successful it is. Those concepts haven't changed that much. What has changed is some advances in the technology, many of which were already speculated upon in the book, but a few leaps that I had not recognized. In particular, the book came out while CRISPR-Cas9 was breaking on the scene, while we were finally having breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, particularly in what is now called deep learning, that then catapulted into what we now call large language models. But though these advances have been made, they haven't changed most of the core questions. So in the preface, I wanted to deal with the acknowledgement of these advances, but also underscore why the advances themselves did not necessarily alter the importance of grasping the foundational issues that inform how we are going to make decisions about emerging technologies. And I think, surprisingly, that's, again, more successful than I had expected. I'm finding serious audiences that are asking me to talk specifically about the book, even though the core of the book is almost a decade old now.
We've seen and experienced massive shifts in technological development over the past decade, especially when it comes to AI. But are we making the same advances in applying AI ethics? I asked Wendell what he thinks is the biggest moral question we're still to answer amid this rapid change.
Well, I think the most significant question is the appropriate use of these technologies, when we should embrace them, when we should reject them, when we should regulate them. And if we are going to regulate them, in what form? Is it technological guardrails? Is it standards? Is it regulations? Is it international law? So that hasn't changed. What has changed is the rapidity with which artificial intelligence in particular has become totally embedded in our society. and will be more and more entangled with daily decision making than any of us had probably anticipated 10 years ago. We knew it was coming, but we also knew that there had been a history of roadblocks. And there's no doubt that the large language models, the manipulation of visual imagery, the ability for systems to code, all of that has taken an exponential leap forward, particularly with the release of ChatGPT and the fact that ChatGPT was made available to the public. So we are now in this universe where the use of these technologies, both consciously and unconsciously, is part and parcel of all of our daily lives. And I don't think any of us had anticipated that that would go that rapidly. But I also think it's a misnomer to think these systems are fully intelligent. They have major gaps. And unfortunately, the infatuation with them is allowing us to be somewhat blind to not only the gaps, but how the uses of these technologies are distorting what it means to be human, how humans will interact and engage in the future, and whether we're even building a future about that the humans or respect for biological life and the environment will have a leading role.
What should we then ask ourselves as members of society when we see these massive developments happening? What are some guiding questions that we can ask ourselves?
Well, I think the number one question is, what is the trajectory? And when you look at that trajectory, whose interest does it serve? Does it really serve the interest of the general public and even the near future of humanity? Or is it largely being decided for political and commercial purposes? So that's the underlying question. And then what kinds of rationales are being made for the present trajectory and the decisions being made? And are those rationales in alignment with underlying realities, or are those rationales precipitating actions that actually force a restructuring of reality in a way that serves particular political and economic interests?
So, as citizens, there are questions we can ask ourselves in the face of these AI developments. But what progress is being made in the governance of these technologies? You mentioned also in chapter 1 of your book, A Dangerous Master, even though we are not on an inevitable course, there is no broad plan in place to manage our deployment of new technologies. Is this still the case today when we look at governance?
I think it's very much the case. I mean, the one thing that has thrilled me is when I first got into this world, there were probably 200 people who cared about any of it. And half of them, as I mentioned, were transhumanists, more concerned with whether governments were going to interfere with their right to enhance themselves. Now we have millions upon millions of informed and even semi-informed citizens. We have endless initiatives. We have maybe 40 to 100,000 people who are declaring themselves AI ethicists or AI law and policy people, or at least trying to carve out a niche. So it's not that from the bottom up there are not all kinds of proposals being made. But what is sad is the limited ways in which that has percolated to the level of regulations and corporate policies. And more importantly, the limited sense in which we have any form of international governance of artificial intelligence. And that's regardless of the fact that the UN and Secretary General Guterres, with his tech envoy Amandeep Singh Gill, have put together various panels that have made recommendations. I get very confused about whether all of this is diluting the core needs for the governance of AI and creating so many cross currents and competition among individuals and groups that then gets used by those who are not interested in policy oversight, too much latitude.
The OECD does count more than 1,000 soft governance initiatives related to AI today,
Right.
and there's also some hard law also in place today. And one important part of your work on governance was through the Carnegie Council, when you were co-director with Anja Kaspersen on the AI and Equalitative Initiative, where you put together a framework for the international governance of AI. It is a very comprehensive and complete proposal, and so I'll put in the show notes for anyone interested, the link to the site and the page where this is. Could you still walk us through the principles of that framework and how are we actually going to really achieve this?
So this was perhaps one of the first and most comprehensive frameworks that has ever been put forward. Anja Kaspersen and my role, yes, we were the organizers of the 2 workshops that this came out of, and we probably played a pretty central role in the editing of it. But I would not like it to be represented as our framework, because there are many people, including leadership from the UN itself, that was important in the development of this framework. And though, some of us, I had written papers with Gary Marchant at ASU before this framework came into being about the international governance of AI. This particular framework, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, she asked us to complete it in time for the 2023 ITU meeting of AI for Good. So we got it published in advance of that, and I was able to hand it to Amandeep Singh Gill at that meeting. Now, that said, it's hard to know what impact this all has, but we know that not only Amandeep, but many members of the higher order panel that he was overseeing at the UN, some of them told us that it did influence their thinking, and it's clear that some of the recommendations they made were very similar to what we put forward. But there were 5 elements: a technical organization that was going to sort through existing legal frameworks and underscore the best practices, a global AI observatory, a normative governance capacity to have some degree of punishment or compliance authority, conformity assessment, and the development of technological tools, meaning tools built into AI itself that might help in its guidance. So all of this has become part and parcel of the way people talk about governance today. Now, the extent to which we drew on ideas that others were already putting out there, the extent to which we influenced the present discussion, I don't worry about that. That's not the name of the game, and the name of the game isn't about who did what. It's about, are we progressing?
I want to also just quickly look at chapter 12 of your book, A Dangerous Master, because it does explore some ideas for governance. And in that chapter, you state governance coordination will only work if it provides an effective means to address the ever-increasing gap between the appearance of a technology and the management of its societal impact. Can we reflect on that a bit? Are you confident that we'll be able to limit this ever-increasing gap?
So this is a great and difficult question. I'm a cup is half full man. So I always feel that we can meet our challenges when and if there's the will to do so. But at the moment, we're on a horrible trajectory. And the evidence is not there that that trajectory will be intentionally righted in the near term. So at the moment, I am somewhat pessimistic. But I also recognize that we are in a bridge period between the culture that was born out of the Second World War and a new culture that we don't know what it's going to be yet. And we don't even know whether it's going to be in human interest, the culture we're building. But we are in this bridge period, and so that's a period of opportunity. And so the seeds we lay may be critically important, and how quickly we get through that bridge and whether we can minimize harm to humans and the environment during that period, that's still up in the air.
If we are in what Wendell calls a bridge period, where can we draw inspiration? I asked Wendell what we could potentially learn from the principles of bioethics as we look at how we approach AI technologies today.
So bioethics actually was born probably out of the Hastings Center, a body I've been associated with. And it's become a catch-all for all ethical considerations having to do with life in all of its form, but particularly human life. And it grew especially out of medical ethics and research ethics. So research ethics is this new field that came out of the Second World War in the 1950s and early 60s that focused on human subject research and the informed consent, respect for human autonomy, justice or equality. So there have been these four principles in at least the medical side of bioethics, which is basically do no harm, justice and equality, a respect for autonomy. And these were seen as an ethical system where the principles kind of worked in partnership with each other. And it became something less than an absolute system, but a system that has actually been pretty effective, particularly in medical ethics. So that's an important part of bioethics. But I think bioethics itself and ethics has to become something more than what it has been. Because as other institutions are being questioned and undermined, so too are our ethical foundations. And partially because our ethical foundations have been inadequate for dealing with these kind of complex critical decisions that are coming up in emerging technologies and climate management, in a vast array of different areas that don't really succumb to a lot of the pathways we have had for making critical decisions. So I think of ethics, not just bioethics, but ethics in general, as a series of languages for interpolating between what we understand and what we don't understand. We are moving into a world of complexities and uncertainties, tons of blind spots, and how are we going to interpolate? And what kinds of role will normative values play in that? What kind of roles will procedures such as consequentialism play in that? And to what extent do we need to evolve individually in our moral intelligence and collectively in our multilateral decision-making processes?
So, as Wendell told me, we're moving into a future of complexities and uncertainties, and likely just as much change as the past years have shown. After speaking about his book, A Dangerous Master, 1 Decade On, my final question to him was what he hopes we will have achieved in governing emerging technologies 10 years from now.
Well, I guess I'm hopeful that some crisis will happen that will rally humanity around demanding that international constraints be put in place. And not only just constraints, but hopefully some normative mechanism for penalizing those who violate those constraints. I know all the arguments against why you don't want this and how it's going to interfere with innovations. And that's all true. And perhaps in the calculus of history that we will never be able to make because we won't know what happened if we went down different roads, the advantages to humanity from not having those constraints, for example, in the forms of medical cures and so forth, will outweigh the advantage you think you're gaining by putting those constraints in place. But I don't buy it. I really don't buy it. I think we could destroy this planet fairly quickly if we don't have constraints on the use of AI that are comparable to the constraints we're putting on the use of nuclear and other high-powered munitions. Because at this point, they are becoming part and parcel of the nuclear and other high-powered munitions. They're just becoming the targeting mechanisms. They're becoming the delivery systems, or part and parcel of the delivery systems and where the decisions are being made. Maybe synthetic biology will come up with some grand ways of saving the environment because we reincarnate the mastodons and produce them in the billions so that they keep the tundra secure and all the methane doesn't get released from the tundra. Just to give an example of one of the arguments being made. Yes, but we could also create synthetic organisms that cause collapse in ecosystems and in our food supply. So if there are not clear guidelines about the deployment of new organisms that are created within the laboratory, we open ourselves up for serious unanticipated dangers. I hate to think in this way, but the rough estimates are that the world population will reach 9 billion somewhere around 2050. But it could also reach 6 billion by 2050. With all the pain and suffering that entails. That doesn't stop me from doing anything I'm doing, because even if it's 6 billion, it won't be 5 billion. And I'm not trying to say that to generate fear. I'm just trying to say that in the sense that we are playing with fire and we are letting commercial and political interest define the decisions we're making. And that is opening us up to a world of disinformation, of misinformation, of manipulation of our attitudes and our actions in ways that perhaps serve some groups, particularly those who happen to have stock in the relevant corporations. But it's not serving humanity as a whole. Yeah. So let's give the next generation a chance and put some form of effective oversight in place for the emerging technologies, and particularly AI.
Thank you so much, Wendell, for your time.
Thank you ever so much. Goodbye.